You ever wake up one morning, look out your window, and see a bulldozer tearing up your backyard like it's some kind of construction site? Yeah, that was my Monday. Name's Barrett Stokes. I'm a 48-year-old electrician, semi-retired, and I've lived on this 5-acre stretch of land for over 20 years. Paid it off with sweat, busted knuckles, and more overtime hours than I care to count. My property sits just outside the edge of a neighborhood that got swallowed up by that monster called the Rolling Pines HOA about 5 years back. I never opted in, never signed a thing, because I like my land quiet, my truck loud, and my mornings mine. That piece ended with the sound of jackhammers. At first, I thought they were working on the old drainage line near the road, but when I stepped outside, I saw surveyor flags dotting my back acre, the flattest part of my land. By Friday, they had poured the foundation for what looked like the first of several structures. I marched up to the foreman, a wiry guy with a clipboard and a permanent sunburn. "This is private property," I told him. He glanced at his paperwork. "Says here this parcel is part of Rolling Pines Commercial Expansion Project, approved by the HOA board." I tilted my head. "You mean the HOA that I'm not part of?" He squinted. "Look, I just build, man. If there's a problem, talk to your association." So I did. Well, I tried. The next morning, I showed up at the Rolling Pines clubhouse during their weekly meeting. That's where I met her Janessa Vanderley, the HOA president. Mid-50s, bleach blonde bob, sharp red nails, and a voice that sounded like it had been trained yelling at retail workers. I knocked once before stepping in. She didn't even look up. "Residents need to use the online form to request time." "I'm not a resident," I said. "I'm Barrett Stokes. I own the land where you're building 12 commercial units." Her head snapped up so fast I thought she'd pulled something. "That's impossible," she said. "That land was annexed into Rolling Pines 2 years ago, without my signature," she sniffed. "The board voted. We followed all internal procedures." I pulled out a folded paper from my jacket. "This is the deed, Janessa, shows clear boundaries. No easements, no annexation, and no HOA authority." She waved it off like I'd handed her a napkin. "That document means nothing here. The board has spoken." I could have fought it then. Could have called the sheriff or hired a lawyer, but something in her smug little face made me pause. 12 buildings. Foundations poured, crews scheduled, permits filed. I decided to wait, let them pour every cent into it, let them build, let them dig the hole deeper. Janessa smiled like she'd won. "If you don't leave, I'll call security." I tipped my hat. "Don't worry. I'm not going anywhere." And I meant it. Because the deeper they built, the sweeter the fall was gonna be. By the second week, the buildings had walls, metal frames, beige siding, ugly as sin, but rising fast. I spent most mornings on my porch swing, coffee in hand, watching the crews hammer and weld like it was some kind of time trial. Janessa didn't show her face again, but I noticed 2 new security guards in golf carts patrolling the edge of the site. One of them kept eyeballing my property line like he expected me to charge the place with a shovel. I didn't. I just waited. I had already been to the county recorder's office, pulled every zoning map, land survey, and permit application they had on file. Took the better part of a day, but it was worth it. That's where I met Curtis Yen, a clerk with a memory like a steel trap and a habit of narrating as he worked. "Here's the original plat from '96. No amendments filed. Okay, Rolling Pines expansion application, logged 2 years ago." "Wait a second." He squinted at his screen, then reached for a thick binder under his desk. "There's no property owner consent here," he said. "They filed a parcel absorption form, but there's no notarized agreement. That's a red flag." I leaned on the counter. "Can a homeowners association just absorb private land without consent?" He shook his head. "Absolutely not. They can petition the city to rezone or annex, but that only flies if the owner signs off. Otherwise, it's trespassing." I left with copies of everything. Every missing signature, unfiled consent form, and permit stamped without my name. I also had a peek at the construction financing. Rolling Pines had floated nearly $800,000 in loans against the projected rental income from those buildings. I wasn't just going to stop them. I was going to sink them. By the third week, the crews had moved to the interior's drywall, wiring, HVAC. There were electricians crawling all over the units, none of them union, all of them underpaid subcontractors from 2 towns over. I knew the type. Fast work, cheap labor, zero liability. I struck up conversations with a few of them, not to tip my hand, just to hear what they'd been told. "This whole block's gonna be medical offices," one guy said between bites of his sandwich. "Urgent care, dental, maybe even a pharmacy." HOA said they already leased 2 of them. I didn't ask who signed the leases. I already knew they were fraudulent. The real kicker came when I received a letter in the mail, gold embossed and printed on thick, overpriced paper. It was an invitation to the Rolling Pines grand commercial reveal scheduled for that Saturday. Hors d'oeuvres, live music, ribbon cutting, the whole charade. The envelope also included a request for me to cease unauthorized presence on HOA grounds and respect community development boundaries. That's when I called Dana. Dana McBride had been my attorney for years, handled the sale of my property back in the day, helped me write up contracts for my electrical business before I sold it. She was sharp, thorough, and had a particular loathing for overreaching bureaucrats. After I explained the situation, she asked only one question. "They've built how many structures?" 12, I said. "Each one about 1,800 square feet," she paused. "Barrett, they've committed felony-level trespass and fraud." "Good." She filed the cease and desist that afternoon. The next day, she filed a civil suit for unlawful construction, land theft, and damages exceeding $2 million. But we weren't stopping there. Dana also contacted the county zoning office. Turns out, some of those permits had been fast-tracked using a forged signature mine. That alone kicked off a criminal investigation. The sheriff's office got involved, so did the district attorney, and still, I didn't say a word to Janessa. Saturday morning rolled around and I polished my boots. Not out of vanity, but because I like to look sharp when I'm about to dismantle someone's entire empire. I put on my clean flannel, grabbed my folder of documents, and walked over to the ribbon cutting like I owned the place. Because I did. There were maybe 60 people gathered, real estate agents, prospective tenants, HOA board members in matching shirts. A local string quartet played near the podium, and someone had set up a mimosa bar. Janessa stood near the center, her hands clasped in front of her like she was posing for a campaign photo. She spotted me immediately. "You're not welcome here," she said as I approached. "This is a private event." "Funny," I said. "Considering it's on my land." She laughed, the kind of laugh people use when they're not sure if they're being threatened. "This again," she said. I held up a manila folder. "This is a cease and desist signed and filed. This is a civil suit also filed. And this," I pulled out the zoning map with my name printed in bold, "is the original deed showing I never relinquished a square inch of this property." People were listening now. The music had stopped and a few of the agents had started whispering. Janessa reached for the papers, but I pulled them back. "You don't get to touch these," I said, "but the sheriff does." Right on cue, 2 deputies stepped through the crowd. One of them, a tall guy with a badge that looked too tight on his belt, made a beeline for Janessa. "Janessa Vanderley, you're under investigation for criminal trespass, construction fraud, and submitting forged documents to a municipal office." She turned pale. "What? This is Rolling Pines project. You'll get a chance to explain," the deputy said. "At the station." They didn't cuff her, but they didn't let her walk away either. One of the board members tried to intervene, but the second deputy stepped between them. The crowd scattered fast after that. The quartet packed up. The mimosas were left untouched. One of the developers tried to argue about breach of contract, but Dana, who had arrived just moments earlier, handed him a letter from the court freezing all leasing activity until the lawsuit was resolved. I walked back home as the sun started dipping low, the unfinished buildings casting long shadows across my field. They looked less like opportunity now, more like monuments to arrogance. Back on my porch, I poured myself a glass of sweet tea and sat down just as my phone buzzed. It was Curtis from the county office. "You'll be happy to know," he said. "The zoning board just voted to revoke all the permits. They said it's the clearest case of permit fraud they've seen in 20 years. I thanked him and hung up. Across the field, one of the workers was loading tools into a van. He glanced toward my house, then gave a little wave. I waved back. Let the HOA build their little empire. Now they could watch it collapse. The following Monday, a flatbed truck arrived to haul away building supplies, but the driver stopped short when he saw the yellow tape wrapped around the perimeter. Deputies had placed it after the zoning board revoked every permit tied to the project. No one was allowed to touch a thing, not a nail, not a brick, until the investigation ran its course, Dana called that afternoon. "They're trying to file an emergency injunction to salvage the leases," she said, claiming the buildings were constructed in good faith. I chuckled. "Good faith doesn't usually involve forged signatures." "Exactly," she said. "The county DA doesn't appreciate being lied to." By Wednesday, the DA's office had filed formal charges against Janessa and 2 board members: fraudulent land annexation, falsified public records, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. The developer who'd signed on to rent the units, a guy named Lil Garvin, was also under review for knowingly entering into a lease on land with disputed ownership. The deeper investigators dug, the more they uncovered. Turns out, Rolling Pines had a history. 3 years ago, they tried to push a similar commercial expansion into a neighboring cul-de-sac. That one fell through after a resident caught wind of an unannounced surveyor planting markers behind his garage, but the board had never been slapped for it. They'd backed down quietly, paid a few fines, and moved on. This time, they'd gone too far. I stayed out of the spotlight as much as I could. Reporters started showing up anyway, parking down by the mailbox and pointing cameras toward the half-finished buildings. I'd close the gate every morning, padlock it by noon, and let the silence do the talking. One afternoon, a man in a navy blazer stepped out of a black SUV and called out to me from the edge of the field. "Mr. Stokes, I'm with the State Real Estate Commission. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I met him by the fence. "Depends," I said. "You here to talk or sweep this under the rug?" He pulled out a laminated badge and held it up. "We're investigating the use of falsified property records across 3 counties. Your case is the largest so far." That got my attention. "How many properties?" 17, he said. "All tied to HOAs attempting to reclassify private land. Yours is just the first where construction actually happened." He asked if I'd testify before the commission. I agreed on the spot. Meanwhile, the buildings stood like hollow boxes, untouched and growing more useless by the day. The drywall inside had already begun to warp from humidity. Rats had moved into one of the corner units. Someone spray-painted "Thieves" across the aluminum siding one night in dripping red letters. The HOA tried to save face. They put out a newsletter claiming the project had been suspended due to unforeseen legal complications. Janessa's name was scrubbed from the letterhead. A new interim president, a retired insurance adjuster named Clive Rayner, issued a bland statement urging calm and unity. I didn't respond directly. I let Dana handle the legal side while I focused on something else, reclaiming my land. I called in a surveyor, this time a real one, licensed and vetted. Took 2 days, but he remarked the boundaries with precision. He gave me a full digital layout, which I submitted to the county to have the development formally voided from their database. Next, I filed for demolition permits. The county said I'd have to wait until the court finalized the ownership dispute, but with every document in my favor and the original deed untouched, that process moved fast. By the beginning of the next month, the judge ruled in my favor. Dana called me the minute the ruling was filed. Congratulations, she said. You now legally own 12 unauthorized structures. Can't wait to tear 'em down. Hold on, she said. You might want to consider another option. I paused. Go on. You could auction the buildings as prefab units, sell them to a relocation company. Let someone else pay to move them and you profit from the whole mess. I liked the sound of that. Within days, Dana arranged for an asset recovery firm to inspect the buildings. They found 9 of the 12 salvageable. After structural assessments and appraisals, I put them up for sealed bid. 2 weeks later, a modular construction company offered to buy the units, haul them off-site, and even pay to restore the soil underneath. I took the deal. The day the first building was lifted off its foundation, I stood by the fence again, this time with a cold beer in hand. A crane operator gave me a thumbs up as he maneuvered the frame onto a flatbed. It felt like watching a parasite get peeled off your skin. Word spread fast. Residents of Rolling Pines started asking questions loudly. I heard about a town hall meeting where Clive Rayner was nearly shouted off stage. Homeowners were furious. Their dues had funded the illegal construction, and now they were on the hook for legal fees and loan penalties. One woman, a retired schoolteacher, found me at the hardware store and apologized on behalf of the neighborhood. I never knew what that woman was doing, she said. We trusted her. Don't worry, I said. She'll be answering to more than just you. The state commission hearing was held 2 weeks later in a courthouse 2 towns over. I showed up with Dana, wearing a clean shirt and boots that still had a little mud from the field. I gave my testimony under oath, described how they built without consent, how they forged signatures, how they tried to push me out with fake notices and threats. When I mentioned the missing permits and altered zoning maps, a commissioner leaned forward and scribbled something down with real urgency. After I stepped down, the chairwoman addressed the room. This is not an isolated case, she said. We're seeing a pattern of HOAs engaging in unauthorized expansion under the guise of community development. This board will be recommending a statewide audit of all associations with commercial property interests. Dana nudged me gently with her elbow. You just kicked over a hornet's nest, she whispered. Good, I said. Let 'em sting each other. By the end of the month, Janessa had been indicted, not just for what she did to me, but for a half-dozen other violations dating back years: misappropriation of dues, bribes to city inspectors, even wire fraud tied to falsified payments from a shell company she operated out of a P.O. box. The woman had built her little empire on rot. The Rolling Pines HOA was placed under court-appointed supervision. A third-party administrator was brought in. Clive resigned. The board was gutted. Residents finally got access to the financial records they'd been denied for years. What they found wasn't pretty. As for me, I took the money from the building's sales, nearly $160,000 after taxes, and used it to seed a new project: a small machine shop near the front of my acreage. Nothing flashy, just something I could tinker in, maybe rent a bay or two to up-and-coming tradesmen. Real work, built the right way. One morning, as I was measuring out the concrete pad for the foundation, I noticed a familiar sedan creeping along the road. It was one of the former board members, Curtis Bell, the treasurer. He didn't stop, but he slowed down enough to meet my eyes. Then he looked away and drove off. I didn't wave. He had signed every forged document right alongside Janessa. No apology was coming, and I didn't need one. I had my land back. I had justice, and I had a front-row seat to watch the empire they built turn to dust. Let the next HOA think twice. 3 weeks after the last modular unit was hauled off my land, I received a call from the district attorney's office. A grand jury had just returned a fresh indictment, this time not just against Janessa and her 2 cronies, but against the entire Rolling Pines HOA Corporation. They were pursuing it under a relatively obscure provision of state law that allows criminal prosecution of non-governmental organizations for systemic fraud. Your case cracked something wide open, the assistant DA told me. This HOA wasn't just overstepping, they were laundering money through shell development firms and defrauding residents out of hundreds of thousands in dues. "We're filing under racketeering." That word hit different. I'd seen it in headlines. Used to describe crime families, not neighborhood boards. But the evidence was there. Dana forwarded me the court order unsealing the investigation records. It read like a pulp novel. Fake invoices, padded vendor contracts, kickbacks on construction deals, all of it orchestrated under the guise of community improvement. Janessa wasn't just power-hungry, she was running a criminal enterprise out of a clubhouse. Subpoenas had gone out to over a dozen entities, contractors, title processors, even a landscaping company that had billed Rolling Pines $30,000 to relocate native shrubs. Turns out, the shrubs never existed. The money went straight into a joint account held by Janessa and her nephew, who also happened to be the HOA's former environmental consultant. Residents of the neighborhood were livid. With court oversight still in place, they were finally seeing where their dues had gone. One man, a retired mechanic named Lewis who'd lived there since the first houses were built, told me he hadn't had working streetlights on his side of the subdivision for over 2 years. "They said there wasn't room in the budget," he said, standing beside his rust-colored Ford. "But somehow they had money to build dentist offices on your land." I nodded, but I didn't say much. I didn't have to. The truth had finally outrun the lies. The state commission took things even further. In light of the evidence, they passed an emergency mandate requiring all HOAs in the state to undergo third-party audits if they managed more than 100 homes or held development rights. Rolling Pines was ground zero for the reform wave. Their name was now shorthand for everything that could go wrong when unchecked power met bad intentions. But that didn't mean they were done trying. One afternoon, Dana showed up at my shop with a folder under her arm. She looked tired, like she'd been reading too many depositions and not sleeping enough. "They're trying to settle," she said, handing me the file. Inside were documents drafted by the HOA's new legal representatives. They offered me a cash payout, $250,000, to drop the civil suit and sign a non-disclosure agreement. In plain terms, hush money; in their terms, a mutually beneficial resolution to avoid protracted litigation. I didn't even have to think about it. "No deal," I said. Dana nodded. "Didn't think so, but you should see this." She slid over a second document. It was a sworn statement from a former board member, one who hadn't been charged yet, but was clearly trying to save their own skin. The statement laid out a timeline of meetings, votes, and internal memos that showed the board knew my land was never annexed. One memo had Janessa's handwriting scrawled across the bottom. "Push it through anyway. He's old school. Won't fight it." Dana gave me a moment to read it, then leaned back in the chair next to my workbench. "I'm filing for summary judgment next week," she said. "With this, we won't need a trial. You'll win outright and they'll be barred from appealing." I didn't say anything for a while. The only sound in the shop was the ticking of the old wall clock and the wind rattling the garage door. Then I stood up and pulled the chain to open the bay. Sunlight poured in, catching the dust in golden beams. "Let's finish it," I said. The court granted summary judgment 6 days later. I was awarded full legal restitution for land use, damages, and emotional distress. The final figure, $382,000. Add that to the modular building sale and I was sitting on more money than I'd ever planned to earn after retirement, but I wasn't interested in sitting. With the legal war behind me, I poured that money into the shop. Bought newer lathes, high-end welding gear, and a CNC router I'd been eyeing for years. I converted the side bay into a classroom and started offering weekend workshops for local kids who wanted to learn trades, real ones. Wiring, fabrication, mechanical repair. Things that couldn't be faked with a clipboard and a title. One Saturday, a beat-up Honda pulled into the gravel lot. Out stepped a teenage boy with oil stains on his jeans and a socket wrench poking out of his back pocket. He looked around, nervous. "You teach welding here?" he asked. "Only if you're not afraid to get your hands dirty," I said. He grinned. "That's the only way I know how to work." I nodded toward the bay. "Grab a helmet. Booth's open." Later that month, I got a letter from the new HOA administrator. Not an apology, those never came, but a formal notice that the organization had voted to restrict all future development projects pending full member approval and independent legal review. It was the first smart thing they'd done in years. Still, I didn't trust it. So I made sure my land was formally registered with a restrictive covenant. No HOA, no annexation, no development without my signature and a stamped court order. Ironclad. Dana handled the filings personally. The neighborhood quieted after that. No more security patrols, no more survey flags. Just the sound of lawnmowers and kids playing, the way it should have been all along. One evening, I was closing up the shop when a familiar gray sedan pulled into my drive. It was the assistant DA, the same one who'd called me months ago. He stepped out, tie loosened, and looked around the property. "You've done a lot with the place," he said. "Figured I owed it to the land," I replied. He nodded. "Thought you should know the state's pushing for a new bill, would put teeth into HOA oversight. Your case is the reason it's gaining traction." I leaned against the doorframe. "About time somebody noticed what goes on behind those gates." He looked out toward the field, where the sun was setting low over the line of trees that marked my southern boundary. "You ever think about running for something?" he asked. "Planning board, council?" I laughed. "Only thing I've ever run was conduit," he smiled. "Well, if you ever change your mind, let me know." After he left, I stood out there for a while. The crickets were just starting up, and the air was thick with that late summer stillness that comes right before the first frost of fall. I looked out over my land, clear, open, and finally free of other people's bad decisions. The buildings were gone. The lies were exposed. The HOA was gutted and under a microscope, and me? I was back to doing honest work, teaching the next generation how to build something real. No committees. No board meetings, just metal, sweat, and truth. Exactly how it should be.